Welcome to the deep dive. You brought us quite a stack of sources today about this really interesting rumor that's been doing the rounds online, TikTok, Facebook, places like that.
That's right. It's this claim that's gone pretty viral, suggesting, a massive change coming to marriage law in 2026, specifically that cheating could actually become illegal.
Illegal, like with real consequences. The sources mention things like jail time or getting sued if your spouse has proof you cheated. It sounds, well, pretty dramatic.
It does. But right away, looking at the source material you shared, there are pretty strong indications this might not be true. The source itself calls it likely false, or maybe just, online chatter.
Okay, so the truth of it is definitely shaky based on the source. We need to get into that. But what's really grabbed me and what we want to unpack in this deep dive is the reaction. The incredibly strong reactions it's caused, particularly, it seems, among men. So our mission today is sort of twofold. Lay out what the rumor claims, look at what the source says about whether it's true, and then really dig into why something seemingly false is sparking such intense feelings and conversation.
Yeah, it's less about the rumor itself, maybe, and more about what the reaction reveals, what frustrations it's tapping into. So let's start with the source material's description of the actual claims.
Okay, so according to these sources, what are the specifics? What's this supposed new law actually entail starting in 2026?
Well, the core idea is that when you sign that marriage license after 2026, it becomes this kind of binding legal agreement where, infidelity is explicitly an illegal act.
And the consequences. What kind of trouble are people saying you could actually face?
The rumors swirling in the source material suggest if your spouse has enough evidence, solid proof, they could potentially get you arrested or sue you.
Wow. Arrested.
Yeah, and the consequences mentioned are pretty severe. Jail time comes up, being sued indefinitely, having to pay damages like free emotional harm, even physical damage is mentioned.
Huh. One comment highlighted in the source even painted this picture of, like, sitting in jail while being sued and still having to pay up.
Right. And another angle mentioned in the source is framing it simply as, violating the contract, the marriage papers themselves.
Which is interesting because that kind of leads directly into why the source material itself seems pretty skeptical about this whole thing being true.
Exactly. It brings us right to the debunking part, based on the source.
Okay, so let's look at that. What reasons does the source give for doubting this claim? Why does it say this probably isn't happening?
Well, the main point the source brings up is the actual legal nature of marriage, at least in most places. It's described as a civil union or, a civil contract.
Right. And you don't usually get thrown in jail for breaking a civil contract, do you? That's more for, like, criminal stuff.
Precisely. That's the key difference the source material highlights. Now, it does acknowledge that adultery is technically illegal in some states. I think the source mentioned 16 states in the U.S.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, but, and this is crucial, the source clarifies these laws are generally just not prosecuted. They're not enforced in practice. They're kind of just there.
So they exist on paper in some places.
Yeah.
But they're basically dormant laws.
That seems to be the case. And the source also notes the actual trend isn't towards making adultery a crime. It's more towards decriminalizing it in those states where it's still technically illegal.
Okay, that makes sense. The source also raised a really practical point against it, didn't it? Just thinking about the logistics.
Yeah, a very down-to-earth question. I mean, where would you actually put everyone if cheating suddenly led to jail time? The sources point out the jails are already described as, overflowing, overpopulated, even with existing crimes.
That's a pretty solid practical obstacle. Yeah. And did the source touch on whether making it illegal would even, work? Would it stop cheating?
That's another angle. The idea presented is that, look, making it illegal might not actually stop people. It could just, make them sneakier about it, push it underground.
Or find other ways around it.
Potentially. The source mentions it could even inadvertently encourage things like polyamory, as people look for ways to structure relationships outside a law targeting traditional infidelity. So, yeah, these points are raised as reasons why it's probably impractical and maybe even ineffective.
Right. So based on everything the source material lays out, this rumor seems pretty clearly false. Almost certainly not happening. And yet, and this is the fascinating part, the source points out that so many people, specifically a lot of men, are reacting really positively, like happy about it, all for the idea.
Yeah.
According to the source, why? Why this reaction to something that's likely untrue?
And this is really where the source material pivots to analysis, because that strong, positive reaction, especially from men, despite the rumor being, probably bunk. It seems to be tapping into something much deeper, real frustrations.
Okay, what kind of frustrations are we talking about? What's underneath this?
A big one seems to be this widespread feeling of dissatisfaction with current divorce laws, how things play out. Many of the men commenting in the sources seem to feel the system is like inherently unfair to them, stacked against them.
Does the source give any concrete examples of that?
It does.
Yeah.
There's one pretty powerful story shared in the source about a guy married nearly 20 years. His wife cheats on him, but according to this account, he's the one who ends up giving her like $300,000.
Wow.
Yeah, and he's still paying alimony years down the line, still fighting over custody. It's presented as a kind of worst-case scenario that resonates with some people.
Okay, I can see how a story like that would fuel frustration.
Absolutely. And you see this sentiment in the comments cited by the source, this idea that under current laws, if a shorty cheats, that's the phrase used, they can take all your crap. And this leads directly into advice being shared within the source material, like men should always get a prenup. And not just any prenup, but one that specifically says, no alimony, no child support, 50-50 custody guaranteed if there's infidelity.
So the excitement about this idea, this rumor of cheating becoming illegal, it's really tied to this feeling that the current system sometimes lets people get away with infidelity or even rewards them financially.
That's exactly the connection the source material draws, this perception that women might be rewarded for bad behavior, getting money or assets even if they were the ones who cheated.
Right.
And the source directly poses this question, it's quite pointed. If men are supposedly the scumbags, the ones always cheating, then why are men the ones who seem so happy about this potential law?
That's an interesting question.
The source suggests this reaction is kind of telling. It implies that maybe who's reacting so strongly tells you something about who feels most wronged or vulnerable under the current system regarding infidelity.
It really shows how a false rumor can just become this lightning rod for these much bigger underlying issues, doesn't
It
it?
really does. And connected very closely to this strong male reaction, there's another point that keeps coming up in the source material, a specific demand.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Mandatory paternity tests. The source notes a lot of comments saying, okay, if you're going to make cheating illegal, then you absolutely have to include mandatory paternity testing.
Ah, okay. And the reasoning for that, why is that seen as essential?
The reason given, according to the source, is this concern about, quote, too many false paternity tests. The idea is that a mandatory test, if infidelity is proven or suspected, would serve as a man's, quote, last line of defense.
A defense against what? Paying for a child that isn't biologically theirs.
Exactly. Against potential false claims or financial obligations stemming from infidelity where paternity might be in question, it's seen by some commentators in the source as a crucial safeguard.
So like a non-negotiable part of the deal if this hypothetical law were ever real.
That's how it's presented by some, yeah. But, while that male perspective is really prominent in the reactions highlighted by the source, it does also bring in some other viewpoints.
Right, because not everyone wants the same outcome, even hypothetically.
Correct. There's a perspective mentioned, attributed to some women, who say they wouldn't necessarily want their cheating spouse locked up for ages, maybe 6 months to a year, is floated as an idea.
Okay.
But what they really want, indefinite spousal support. The source highlights this very direct quote, run me that fucking check.
So for that perspective, it's much more about the financial consequences than, say, jail time, money over punishment.
That seems to be the focus there, yeah. Although the source also mentions a slightly different take, kind of comparing jail time plus payments to child support, but maybe preferring the money sooner. Still very focused on the financial side.
And what about accountability? Does the conversation extend beyond just the couple?
Sometimes, yes. Some comments cited in the source suggest that the other person, the one involved in the affair, should also face some accountability, especially if they knew the person they were involved with was married.
That makes sense intuitively, but I imagine it gets complicated fast.
It does. The source points that out too, because, often both people involved in an affair might be married themselves. So then who's accountable? How does that work? It opens up a whole other can of worms, legally and ethically.
Definitely not simple. And then the source mentions some more extreme takes too.
Yeah.
Using biblical references.
Right. There's commentary highlighted that brings in figures like Samson, Solomon, even Jesus.
And how are they used in this context?
They're used quite negatively to illustrate what's framed as a danger or risk associated with women. The source notes the use of terms like cooter. The ultimate message from this sort of extreme viewpoint is pretty stark advice for men.
Which is,
Essentially, stay away from women altogether because of the perceived risks and potential betrayals highlighted by this whole cheating rumor discussion and the legal fears it brings up.
wow, that's a really bleak conclusion to drive from all this.
It's certainly presented as being on the more extreme end of the reactions in the source material, yeah. It highlights a very deep sense of perceived risk and potential harm in relationships for some people engaging in this conversation.
Okay, so let's bring it all back together. What's the source material's final word on this whole viral rumor?
Well, the source basically doubles down on its initial assessment. The rumor itself about cheating becoming illegal in 2026 is very likely false. They reiterate that, sure, adultery laws exist on paper in some places, but they aren't really enforced.
So the rumor is debunked by the source.
Yes. But the real story, the source argues, is the reaction. That huge response, especially from men, it shines a light on these really deep-seated frustrations people have with the current legal system, the financial side of marriage, divorce, infidelity.
And the source feels that who is talking about this, who is engaging with this rumor online, is significant.
Exactly. The source suggests that the fact that so many men seem to be the ones jumping into this conversation, supporting the idea, offers some insight. Insight into who feels most affected, maybe most wronged, or perhaps most vulnerable within the existing framework surrounding marriage and cheating.
So pulling back, what's the main takeaway then from this deep dive into what the source says is probably just a false social media rumor?
Well, it seems pretty clear this whole conversation wasn't really about a potential new law coming in 2026. It was more like a proxy debate, a
Yeah.
way to air these much larger underlying tensions.
Tensions around marriage, trust, fidelity, divorce law, money, fairness.
All of it, yeah. We saw how this rumor acted as a sort of catalyst, letting people express anxieties about financial outcomes in divorce, make demands for harsher accountability for infidelity, and even in some cases express really negative views about relationships altogether because of perceived risks.
It definitely raises a bigger question, doesn't it, for you, the listener, to think about. Regardless of whether cheating is illegal or ever becomes illegal, how do our current societal expectations, our existing laws around marriage and divorce, how do they shape our relationships?
Yeah, how do they influence our ideas about trust, about fairness, about what accountability looks like? What does it really tell us when a rumor, something likely untrue, gets such a massive, powerful reaction online?
What does that reaction reveal about the issues, the frustrations that people are genuinely grappling with, maybe just below the surface of all that online chatter?
Something to think about as you go about your day.